our convictions. Please help me welcome Lord Owen.
Good morning. As you know, Vote Leave is a designated group, and we have a collective leadership of three people: Gisela Stewart, Michael Gove, Boris Johnson. All three of them I've watched over the years in Parliament, and I have no hesitation in saying that I have never found the slightest trace of racism in anything that they have said or done, and I'm not prepared to stay silent while their reputations are besmirched. We all know that we are going to need courage and determination to face the British people with the facts, as they are constantly distorted during this campaign. In my judgment, the risks of leaving the EU over a decade or more are far less than the risk of remaining. So we must have the courage of our convictions, state what we believe in, and state it as far as possible in a way that is not destroyed and damaged by personality conflicts and false allegations. Now, I submitted for the designation of the Vote Leave an argument why the sort of left of centre view needed to be represented, and I showed them a poll which showed that 19% after the general election would have been more likely to have voted Labour if that party had promised a referendum. And as I go around the country, I find many people who are not involved in the blue on blue warfare that's going on the front pages of most newspapers, but are currently thinking very hard about these issues and are ready to use their vote intelligently and on the basis of facts. So I will only give you today questions which I have found raised in the campaign so far, and broadly speaking how I've answered them. They are personal views. And there is a much longer press release, and it's all on the record, and it will be distributed to you very shortly. The first question is, what has changed in the EU from the last referendum in 1975? Well, it is absolutely clear. It is the euro. The fact that we now should not talk about just the EU, but always bracket it with the Eurozone. This experimental currency has changed everything in the politics of Europe. Europe was reasonably successful. I know many people were opposed to it all along, and I respect their position, but that has never been mine. But it really began to have its very roots questioned with the failure of the euro, coins and notes introduced in 2002. When the global economic crisis hit us in 2008, the euro was from the start exposed, and within a year we were in a euro crisis as distinct from the global economic crisis. And we are still there, and we are likely to remain there. Mervyn King, in his new book, with the thought-provoking word alchemy in its title, is both clear and simple. The euro crisis will continue. A euro collapse will follow, unless, in effect, it becomes a country, and that emerges inside the EU to run their currency with both a fiscal and a federal union. Why should the centre-left vote to leave? Often comes up. The answer, I think, is that the socially progressive Europe, which many people, and I certainly hoped would come out, died in the austerity following the euro crisis of 2010. Over the last 6 years, since the EU-Eurozone crisis began, the European Council and the Commission have done a great deal to destroy the very concept of the social market. They've acquiesced in levels of unemployment in EU countries not seen since the post-Second World War economic collapse. Over 50% of youth unemployment, unemployment under 25s, has been quite commonplace. Uncontrolled migration has also reached huge levels with far-reaching social consequences, all too often ignored and very rarely provided with the offsetting financial resources. In some countries, in terms of pay and pensions, the wealthy have surged ahead, while the average worker has been lucky to hold their own. Standards in terms of public services, whether the health, education, and housing, have suffered immensely. I have a house in Greece. I've watched the collapse of the euro and the damage that has been done in that country painfully over the last 6 years. Go into the local pharmacy and you see empty shelves. Go into the streets and you see young people with no prospect of jobs whatever. Now, it is necessary for us to take into account, when we look at this question, how dysfunctional the EU has become over the last 6 years. The other thing to say to people is if we were to leave, this is almost the best possible moment to leave. Remember, this is not a general election. This is meant to be a fairly conducted referendum in which the people are asked to give a choice of direction. Stay inside the EU or leave the EU. It is the government of the day that carries out that direction. And this government has been in office for over 6 years, is reasonably experienced. We have fixed-term parliaments. For the next 4 years, the transition will be conducted by this government. There was no real prospect of a general election. It's a general election-free period, which is what you need if you're going to conduct this transition. Now, I'm not sure enough people have focused on the underlying pressure that has been there for decades within the all things European, starting in 1956, but even before that in the European coal and steel community, which is the perfectly respectable aim of creating a United States of Europe. It happens to be one which I have never wanted. It was Hugh Gateskill, when leader of the Labour Party in 1962, who first flagged up that this was the objective and the aim, and that if it were to come about, it would present a major challenge to this country's democracy as a self-governing country. Now, I believe that point where it has come, and I believe it came particularly when the Prime Minister, though little commented at the time, agreed, and this is the statement that he made as part of his so-called renegotiation: Britain shall not impede the implementation of legal acts directly linked to the functioning of the euro, and furthermore will not create obstacles but facilitate such a further deepening. And deepening has real meaning inside the European community. It means taking a whole raft of measures, such are in the 5 Presidents' report, of directly electing the President of the Commission, the President of the Council, the more powers to the European Parliament, and all done on Europe-wide basis, basically to try and clear up what is widely seen as a democratic deficit. Now, it's fair enough, this direction, but be aware of it. That is what will happen if we decide to vote to remain. It will be seen as a license to move this whole momentum forward towards a United States of Europe. And it will, for some people, make sense. It is more likely that the euro will stay. And we know that the finance minister of Germany and the Holland, the Dutch, have basically accepted that the euro will not under any circumstances go. So what we will see under this pressure is a smaller grouping of the 19 creating a United States of Europe, basically to support the euro and make the structural changes that people like Mervyn King and others have long predicted are necessary. And remember that the Bundesbank warned when the euro came into being that it would need this underpinning of federal structures, fiscal unions, and the capacity to transfer money from different parts of the eurozone, like we have in this country, and like any country which has a currency normally has. Now, it's noteworthy that on the 27th of April, Michael Heseltine, a prominent conservative and a supporter of remaining in the EU, was honestly saying his view. One day, he said, we will join the euro. There's no hurry, and I don't think it's going to happen in my lifetime. He's 83, I'm 77. There are many like him in the Remain campaign, closet federalists, who take his view but pretend euro entry will never happen. David Cameron even now claims it will never happen, but he's retiring before the end of this parliament. The facts of matter are, promises are cheap at this stage, but there is an underlying pressure for a United States of Europe, and it will be given a huge uplift and momentum if we were to vote to remain, and we should face up to this. Now, other people ask, tell us the truth about immigration. Well, the total cost of EU founding principle of free movement of labour and people is unknown. Firstly, I do not believe that free movement of people and labour is essential for a single market. I think it is essential for a single currency, and it's certainly essential for a single country. It is a relic of those parts of the founding principles which were aiming quite overtly under Monnet and others for a United States of Europe. The already hard-pressed British taxpayer sees the budgetary cost of the EU rising, and in my view, we have to utilize that money that we would save if we come out in a way that deals with the problems that we are seeing up and down our country because of the consequences of immigration. We have to have a positive message. My own personal view, and it could only be done by a government, it can't be done by this campaign, is that the 10 billion a year, 50 billion if you spent it over 5 years, that we save from coming out, and those are uncontroversial figures, allowing for all the different adjustments and everything like that, and there's an annex to my speech which explains this quagmire of the European budget. Say, starting on the 1st of July 2018, if we have a transition period of 2 years, I would call it a national dividend, rather like we had called the peace dividend after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when we were able to substantially reduce defense budgets. Though I must say, I warn you now, I believe we will have to start to restore some of those defense budgets. And such a national dividend must not go out to government departments in Whitehall. If possible, it should be handled by a minister without portfolio. And it should only take in claims on it from those parts of the country in the UK that are suffering from this very substantial increase in migration. We know, and Jack Straw admitted it, that the Labour Party did make a spectacular mistake in the estimation of East Europeans coming to this country. I'm not one to say that it hasn't benefited us. I think it has substantially benefited us in many respects. But we know that other people have suffered from it, and we have never had the resources going in. If you look at the pressure, say, on the National Health Service, which should be one of the areas, the accident and emergency services have become extremely strained. Why? One of the reasons is that people who first come to this country are much less likely to use their GP and much more likely to use the acute services. We need to buttress those hospitals that are in these areas with extra resources. I'd pay 50% of that 10 billion. And then you look at schools. Because of this, not anticipating this increase in immigration, there have not been enough places available in primary schools, and more people have had to face the situation that they have not been able to get their choice, the one that's nearest their homes. We should alleviate that, and that means building more, providing more resources. And then you look at housing, exactly the same problem. There aren't the low-cost housing in the places where people work. They have to move right out into the suburbs, pay high travel costs. And it is very important, again, in these areas of high immigration, where there is a real shortage of low-cost housing, that we put in money. But do not apply this right across the country as a whole. Make it a special way of dealing with, through no fault of their own, these communities have been faced by higher immigration and social strains and tensions. Now, I'm absolutely confident that this country can live in harmony with many different immigration spells, where they come from the European Union, which, remember, come automatically. We do not control our borders. They come because we are obligated under the treaty to give free entry. And although we check their passports, let's be quite clear about it. With the ECJ hanging, the European Court of Justice hanging in the background, there are very considerable limits on who we can stop. And I think, therefore, to control our own borders, to have more control over who comes in, which is commonplace in Australia and other countries. So we have a quota system, and you have people coming in who can contribute to the economy. All of this means that the good sense of the British people, which has experienced waves of immigration in the past, pretty well all of them have been beneficial and have been taken into our communities and are now much prized people within them. But you can't do this if you don't, A, control your borders, and B, use resources to help those people that are facing these strains and stresses within them. Now, I also think that we now have to face up to one of the other questions, which is how much longer we can put up with this interference that is coming from particularly abroad. Madame Lagarde, I personally don't take great exception to what the Governor of the Bank of England did. It's a tricky position, but let's be clear. The Governor of the Bank of England has a few areas of total independence, but the large part of the Governor of the Bank of England is in serving the government of the day, and that has always been the situation. But Madame Lagarde has come in with the so-called proposals from the IMF. I must say I have some doubt as to how much that has really gone through the IMF procedure. But much more importantly, she's now told us that they're going to come at this issue again, and in June. Now, June is clearly and absolutely in the purdah period which faces us. Now, I think it is absolutely essential that the Cabinet Secretary writes, if necessary, to the Chancellor of the Exchequer and has him write to Madame Lagarde and ask her not to come back during the purdah period. She's had her go, fair enough, we've had to listen to it. It is a French view, not in my view an IMF view, as she and Strauss-Dominic Kahn have conducted themselves in the IMF. I think it's very unlikely we'll ever have another European member head of the IMF. But it is not an unwarranted interference. Now, I also want to say this about how we leave, which is another question that keeps coming up. And that is the question of why this referendum was ever called. It is now absolutely clear that the Cabinet were never given a paper from the Treasury or any other government departments about the effects of coming out of the EU. I think it was personally because most people thought that it was a balanced judgment and it was perfectly fair for the Prime Minister to make this decision in his Bloomberg speech to have a referendum. But then it is similarly the case that no Cabinet papers were put from the Treasury or anyone else warning the Cabinet about making a manifesto commitment to have the referendum and the timing of that referendum before the end of 2017. It is a constitutional outrage and a dereliction of duty that those papers were not presented if the current one that is before us, the current Treasury objectives, and another one I gather is likely to come next week. If it was so dire, if the consequences were so dreadful, if all the propaganda that has been pushed out from that, why was that not presented to the Cabinet 3 years earlier? 2 years earlier, 1 year earlier? And we need to ask those questions. It raises fundamental questions about this referendum, whether it is being conducted fairly and objectively from number 10, and I believe it is not. And the Cabinet Secretary will be held responsible for this by history. But that's not the end of it. The Cabinet Secretary is responsible for the fairness of this referendum by legislation that has been passed by Parliament. He has already been forced to change his mind about some aspects of the Purdah ruling by a select committee, and he, in my view, is given this responsibility. The Electoral Commission doesn't seem to want to get involved, and they think it's the responsibility of the Cabinet Secretary. Now, what happens if we stay? I've already said, and that's one of the constant questions, that the threat of a Eurozone collapse is being considerably underestimated. The Greek crisis is effectively on hold at the moment, and I understand why. Funding is made available in order for them to handle the very difficult situation they have with the need to try to return people to Turkey in order for them, Turkey, to push some of their people in their country, not push because they want to go, to other parts of the EU. Well, all I can say is be careful, and I say it sadly. I do not myself see at the moment that the Greek crisis is anywhere near resolved. But much more important is to look at those aspects of the Italian economy, and which in Annex C I give a lot of figures, and in some of my speech I do too. Italy is facing very serious problems living within the disciplines of the Eurozone. And this is the problem. If you go within the Eurozone, you have to accept financial disciplines. If you can't accept those financial disciplines, the Eurozone starts to crack. And we need to take those risks into account. Now, some people will tell you that it doesn't matter because we are not in the Eurozone. Go to Greece and you will see it does matter. The knock-on effects of a collapse of a country of the size of Italy would be very considerable. So when we hear all these risk assessments, let's have a risk assessment of what are the chances of Italy not being able to stay in. At the moment, quantitative easing, various measures are being made by the ECB, but look at the underlying position, and frequently we have had experts analysing this situation. Well, what about the Treasury analysing this situation? And what about the IMF analysing this situation, instead of just focusing their very narrowed view on what are the potential risks of British leaving the European Union? So I would only say this about some other questions. What are the opportunities outside the EU for this country? I think they are very considerable, but they need time and we need an adjustment. We've been completely open and frank about this. But the idea that this transition period will be so difficult, say we take a 2-year transition, we might decide to opt for taking no changes whatever in our arrangements within the single market during that time. We might decide we want a different arrangement. All of this needs discussion. And it is not acceptable that on the 24th of June, if we are successful, as I very much hope we are on the 23rd, the Prime Minister announces that we will sign up to Article 50 of the treaties. It is no job of the Prime Minister under those circumstances. It is the job of the Cabinet that meets, of Parliament that needs to discuss these decisions, of the papers that should have been presented to Cabinet over the last 3 years to be presented to them and then come forward with recommendations and make decisions. There are very important issues underlying all that, some of which I deal with this in detail when I'm asked questions by it. Now, the other questions are things like what lies behind the idea of a United States of Europe. I'm not going to go into all of this now, but it does behove some of our more if you like, detached columnists who write long pieces to analyze the momentum behind a United States of Europe, to look at what Monet wanted. That's what Gateskill did in 1962. He met with Monet, he met with Spark, and he understood their passion and their commitment to it. And we must say to the British people that this vote to remain is a vote to make it far, far more likely that they will find themselves in a United States of Europe. That Michael Heseltine's wish for a euro, that was not just shared by Michael Heseltine. I came into this issue in 1999 in order to form a group called Europe, New Europe, which worked with Business for Sterling to prevent Tony Blair calling a referendum on the back of what was called the Baghdad bounce. Of course, it never occurred, but he would have been very hard to have defeated in, say, 2003 if that had been successful. And in my view, most of his Labour colleagues who were dissenting at that time from joining the euro would have gone along with it. And we needed an all-party grouping to try and put the case against the euro. The case against the euro, as I say, is not just economic. It is political. It is the paving stone for going in and maybe having to go in very fast in terms of a collapse. And we have signed away all our rights and veto powers on all aspects of the euro and all aspects of the deepening of the Eurozone and the European Union. Beware. This is not false alarms, this is facts, and we should take it seriously. I was in Paris in April on a meeting of the European movement. I've always respected the European movement. On that platform was Michel Rocard, who was a former Prime Minister of France, an old friend of mine ever since the 60s. He's a committed federalist. He wanted and still wants to be a United States of Europe and for France to be in it. Good luck to them. But he knows that I've always opposed federalism, and I haven't just done it on myself. The Cabinet in 1977 had an all-day meeting discussing what was the direction of Europe post the 1975 referendum, called by Jim Callaghan, and I wrote the papers for it at his specific request. And it was very clear that we were committed to the new European community on the basis that it would not become a federalist union. And it is these things in the past which, of course, create great ambivalence inside the Labour Party about Europe. But I believe that amongst many of its voters, there is a real wish to grapple with this issue and come to some firm conclusions. I will leave by saying this. It also means, if we come out of the EU, that we come out of the common foreign and security policy, we come out of this German new proposals that have been held back, again, from the referendum, for a EU defence structure and planning functions, exactly what the United States have been against. I must say, I almost laugh at the situation. The latest input from the United States today is the former mayor of New York and the very successful business head of Bloomberg. Of course he's entitled to come. He employs people in this country. And if you read his speech, which has already been in the Times, it's very moderately phrased. He says he's not here to influence anybody. Well, we used to say, tell that to the Marines. But basically he's here to influence our debate. Well, that's fair enough. But the number of people who come from America not seeming to realize that the State Department has had a long-standing commitment to a United States of Europe in which we would lose all our self-government. It's only been checked by the Pentagon. The Ministry of Defense knows that it wants NATO and it does not want that type of degree of political integration. But they all want us to stay in the EU to put the American view, which is commonly often ours, on economic, political and defense policy. Fair enough, I understand that. But we have other decisions to take which relate to our own people. And when Mr. Bloomberg expresses concern about the effect of leaving on the wages or the job opportunities in Bloomberg in the City of London, he should remember what those wages are in comparison to the wages of the average person in this country. He should realize what their employment prospects have been in comparison to the average person employed in this country. And it does seem to me that our elite, our political elites, have got hugely out of touch with what is actually happening in this country. And it's not happening just in this country, it's happening in the world, it's happening in America. What is this reaction in Middle America that is really surging through their polls? Well, they should analyze that first, really, before coming here to tell us what we should do about it. And that's why I believe President Obama, who I support and strongly approve of and my wife votes for, got really a bloody nose in terms of the opinion polls. The general British public, I hope, will see the 23rd of June as Independence Day, our equivalent of what the Americans call Independence Day, when we take back those powers of self-government that we had deprived them of as a country all those centuries ago. So I'll now leave it open to you to ask questions, and I'll be very happy to deal with them. But there's a lot of detail. There are annexes. I think if those who are interested to read the case I put to the Electoral Commission of why it should be designated, because this was not just a Conservative Party argument, but an argument going much broader than that. The annexes on the Article 50 and also Article 8 of the treaties, which talks about good neighbourliness, which I think should guide our treaty negotiations. Also the funding and the budget arrangements, which many people come in commenting on, explaining why 350,000 is effectively backed up by the ONS numbers. Whether we should use that sum, the ONS takes a different view, but at least it explains the arithmetic. And finally, an analysis of what is happening in Italy. So, first question.
Thank you. Is there a mic?
Yeah.
Thank you, Lord Owen. Chris Yip from ITV News. You're, if I may say so, a rare beast in that you're a non-Conservative, non-UKIP member of Vote Leave standing on that stage, giving us your arguments about why we should leave. Can I just ask for your reaction to a couple of the more controversial statements over the last week? Boris's comments about Hitler, we can argue about what exactly he meant, but they were definitely written in the same sentence in the same newspaper. And also Nigel Farage telling the BBC that violence is the next step if people don't get what they want, if Leave campaigners don't get what they want on June the 23rd. And a second point, if I may ask, you've just said that the EU contributions are £10 billion a week. You'll be aware that Boris Johnson and others are driving around in a big red bus saying it's £350 million a week. So can I just ask you, in other words, you're driving around in a bus with a big fat lie on it because you've just admitted in your speech it's £190 million a week, not 350.
Well, a big fat lie is a rather unobjective statement, if I do.
The question rather.
I'm too old to remember you, but you come from ITV.
I do.
I thought that was an objective news reporting.
And that's why I asked you.
So I would refer you to what I would prefer.